Mr. President, I rise to state my intention to include the Afghan Adjustment Act as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. This involved years of work. This bipartisan legislation is led with Senator Graham, along with Senators Coons, Moran, Blumenthal, Murkowski, Shaheen, Wicker, Durbin, Tillis, and Mullen. Those are just the people who are co-sponsoring this bill, and there is going to be, there's many others that are supporting it on both sides of the aisle. What is this about? Well, it's about our national security. It's about a covenant that we have made and we must keep to those who stand with us on the battlefield. This bill does right by Afghans who worked alongside our troops and shows the world that the United States of America, when we make a promise, we keep it. Nearly 80,000 Afghans who sought refuge in our country are currently in limbo. In just the last few weeks, one of them, who was a translator for our military, who was working 2 jobs to support his family, who was living in legal limbo, was murdered in the middle of the night, working as a Lyft driver. Is that keeping our covenant? Is that keeping our promise? Many of these people are those who risk their own lives and their family safety to protect our service members. That is why this bill is so strongly supported by the American Legion, by the VFW, and that is why it has gotten support from people on both sides of the aisle. These are people who are in our country right now. They're in our country right now. And what this bill does is simply says that they will be vetted, but that we will also keep our promise to those who stood by our military. Among them are translators and humanitarian workers, as well as courageous members of the Afghan military who stood shoulder to shoulder with our troops. They cannot go back. They would be killed. We were right to help these people flee the Taliban and come to the United States, and it now falls on us to help provide them with the stability and the security they need to rebuild their lives here. So many of them want to move on with their lives here in the United States of America, a country that they stood with. We have seen this before. We saw it with the Hmong and the Vietnamese when they came to our country. And many of them now, who are they? They're police officers, they're doctors, they're firefighters, they're people who teach our kids. That is how this has worked in the past, and it has been successful, and it will be successful now. The bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act creates a more efficient system for our Afghan allies to apply for permanent legal status. It's provisional permanent legal status. The legislation makes the process more thorough, as I noted, by requiring applicants to go through vetting that is just as rigorous as the vetting they would have gone through if they came to the United States as refugees, including an in-person interview, a standard that eight former Donald Trump and George W. Bush administration national security officials called the gold standard of vetting. The gold standard of vetting. Senator Graham and I worked closely with many Republicans, including Senator Moran, who's been so helpful as ranking member of the Veterans Committee on this bill, including Senator Wicker, who is on this bill, the ranking member of Armed Services, and the Department of Defense, to strengthen the bill's vetting provisions and to add language that responds to concerns. In addition, the legislation updates a special immigrant visa program to include groups that should never have been excluded from the program in the first place, including the female tactical teams of Afghanistan, which did so much to support our troops. The entire purpose of the Special Immigrant Visa Program is to provide permanent residency to those who have supported the United States abroad, and it's clear to me that these brave women should also qualify. The bill also requires the administration to implement a strategy for supporting Afghans outside of the United States who are eligible for SIV status and ensures that these applicants have a way to get answers from the State Department about their applications. The Afghan Adjustment Act, as I noted, is sponsored by a bipartisan group of 11 co-sponsors with many more who are going to vote for it, and has earned the backing of more than 60 organizations, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion, as well as some of our nation's most revered military leaders, including Admirals Mike Mullen, William McRaven, James Styrides, Generals Richard Myers of the Air Force, Joseph Dunford from the Marine Corps, and Stan McChrystal from the Army. Part of the reason we were able to build such a broad coalition for our bill is because it is modeled after other bipartisan legislation that Congress passed after previous armed conflicts. After the Vietnam War, Congress passed a law, as I noted, that allowed thousands of people to resettle in the U.S., including many among refugees who now call Minnesota home. As I noted, they are such success stories. They are in the legislature. They are farmers and bakers. They are builders and inventors. They started families. Congress also acted similarly following the Cuban Resolution and the Iraq War to protect allies and friends. In each instance, our country welcomed these immigrants, and we have benefited immeasurably from their contributions. If we act to help our Afghan allies just as we helped other allies, we will continue this tradition of not leaving people behind, of keeping our covenants. Think of these stories. A few months ago, I had a meeting with a group of Afghan women who served in the Afghan National Army's female tactical platoon, including one of the group's commanders, Manaz. Our troops heavily relied on the platoon during the war, as our soldiers pursued missions hunting down ISIS combatants on unforgiving terrain and freeing prisoners from the grips of the Taliban. These women had their backs. The platoon worked especially closely with our military support team and facilitated conversations between our soldiers and the Afghan women that they crossed paths with in the field. Manaz, she's now living in limbo. But some of her biggest advocates fighting for her and her platoon to secure residencies are the American soldiers they serve with. And I know every one of my colleagues has heard from American soldiers about these brave Afghans that served with our soldiers. In U.S. Army Captain Mary Kohler's words, Manaz might as well be my sister. They've sacrificed for their country and for ours. The bond between our units is inseparable. The deep respect is mutual. Manaz knows what her sacrifice cost her. She's more than 6,000 miles from the place she once called home, with little hope of ever returning. She's separated from so many of the people she once shared her life with. But even knowing the cost of her sacrifice, she says she would do it all again. I am in absolute awe of her grit and her patriotism and the many stories. I will be telling these stories every day throughout this week, and I hope that we will come together and make sure that she and so many other of these brave Afghans have a path in this country. It is example after example of these stories. Ahmad spent 4 years training to serve in the Afghan military. He was selected for Afghanistan's elite aviation unit, which worked closely with Americans' military in our fight against the Taliban. Reflecting on his experience, he said, "In the face of danger, we were united, we were relentless, we were resilient." His helicopter was shot down, not once, but twice, but that didn't diminish his resolve. but his experience since the evacuation has been shattering. He now lives in Alabama, thousands and thousands of miles away from his family. He works 2 jobs to make ends meet and sends what he can back to the loved ones he left behind. And he knows full well that the foundation he's building here in America could dissolve in a second if he doesn't get some kind of provisional status, which this Congress can grant, just as it did with the Vietnamese and the Hmong, and after the Iraq War, and after the Cuban Revolution. He was there for us in time of need, and we must be there. Another man, I'm not going to reveal his name, he's asked that it not be revealed because of his family back in Afghanistan. While he and his wife and children were able to evacuate to the U.S., he lives in fear of the Taliban retaliating against his other loved ones back in Afghanistan. He served in the Afghan National Army for years and worked as a liaison with our forces. He even trained in the U.S., graduating from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. But Afghanistan was his home, and he always believed that was where he would remain. That changed when the Taliban seized control. Fearing for his safety, he and his family rushed to the airport in Kabul, weaving through countless Taliban checkpoints, knowing that any wrong move would be their last. Today, he's in Kansas. But the anxiety for the people at home and not knowing if he too will be sent back. Another story, a man named Tashmurad. He is afraid that the Taliban will target his family if his name becomes public, and that's why this isn't really his name, but it's a name he asked be used. Back in his home country, he flew missions with the Afghan Air Force. To use his words, his job was to capture the bad guys like Al-Qaeda and Taliban. He had dreamt of flying since he first saw an Afghan pilot make an emergency landing in his village when he was about 10 years old. When he found out that he would have to learn English to fly, he started trying to teach himself from a book that he bought at a local shop. He went on to earn a degree in language and culture with a focus on aviation, and then took part in flight training from our military, from the U.S. military. He then spent 10 years as a military pilot, where he flew as high as 25,000 feet, helping American soldiers identify Taliban positions in the mountains of Afghanistan. He was stationed about 300 miles from his family when the withdrawal began. His squadron leader ordered him to fly back to support the evacuation. Even though it was getting dark, he turned his airplane lights off to avoid being detected and shot down. Because of his tact and his skill, he landed safely. His commanders advised him not to leave the airport, but he knew he needed to see his family. He made a brief trip home to his pregnant wife and kids and said goodbye before he returned to join the airlift operation. That was almost 2 years ago, and he hasn't seen his family since. Today, he lives in Roanoke, Virginia. He delivers food to make extra money. He works as a water technician. Every extra cent that he makes, he sends back to his family. He still dreams of flying, but more than that, he dreams of reuniting with his wife and kids. He dreams of buying a 2-bedroom house for his family, and he dreams of a safe and stable life in the country that he risks everything for. More stories. 2 Afghan Air Force pilots and friends. Their paths to become women pilots were hardly straightforward, but through sheer persistence and skill, they both made it happen. The 2 women were at aviation training in Dubai when the withdrawal began. In an instant, their lives were turned upside down. I ask you to imagine how you would feel if you were in a foreign country and you realized that you couldn't safely, all of a sudden, couldn't return home. They knew that their careers put their loved one at risk, so they called their families and told them to round up their uniforms, their pilot IDs, and their diplomas and burn them. Hasina watched over a video call as her mom destroyed the evidence of the life she had worked so hard to build. All my dreams were on fire, she once reflected, and I was just watching. She arrived in the United States, she and her friend, with one suitcase each. They began waiting tables at a strip mall in Fort Myers, Florida, hoping one day to return to the skies. Those are just a few of the examples. My colleagues, there are 80,000 of those stories, 80,000 of those stories, and we have a covenant to keep. You talk to any soldier that served over in Afghanistan, and they will have stories to tell. And it is our job to uphold the promises that were made to those that serve with us. Because if we don't uphold those promises, what do you think is going to happen the next time when we ask others to serve with our own military? I am so proud that we have such strong bipartisan support for this amendment, that we have those in the Senate that have worked on these issues for so long supporting this. And I am convinced that when we have the vote on this amendment, we will finally be able to put our heads up proudly and say, our covenant has been kept. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thanks, Mr. President. I'm honored to follow Senator Klobuchar in advocating for the Afghan Adjustment Act, which we strongly hope and believe will be an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. And I just want to begin where she finished, to talk about the American troops who depended on these Afghan allies who now are at risk. I know firsthand about the translators and guards and others who served putting their lives on the line because, like many of my colleagues, I visited Afghanistan. I saw them at work. And now in Connecticut, I've had the privilege of calling many of them my friends and their families, dear friends. And I also know firsthand because my son Matthew, who was a Marine Corps infantry officer in Afghanistan, had a translator whom he succeeded in bringing back this country, but only because he's a lawyer and he knew how to navigate the intricate and challenging rules that apply. It took him 2 years to bring back the man who helped him survive his time in combat there. Senator Klobuchar is absolutely right. It is a promise. Great nations keep their promises. These individuals are among our most loyal friends. The test is that they put targets on their backs from the Taliban. They knew they and their families would be at risk if the Taliban ever took over. Now the Taliban has done it, and they cannot return, nor can their families. So I want to thank all of my colleagues, the bipartisan group that strongly supports this amendment, but I also particularly want to thank our veterans who literally camped out on the swamp outside the Capitol for days, weeks, hoping at the end of the last session that we would adopt this measure. Our veterans are standing strong behind our allies, Afghan allies, whom they know put their lives on the line for them, whom they know put their families at risk for them. And I am grateful to our veterans groups, the USOs, the kinds of allies that we have individually and all around the country who have said they're going to make it a priority to make sure we treat fairly these Afghan allies. We should give them permanent status, a path to permanent status in this country rather than the temporary, uncertain status that they have right now. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank Senator Blumenthal for his comments and Senator Klobuchar, who has been dogged on this issue of Afghan refugees. And thank you for your leadership on this. And I want to thank Senator Lee, who's allowing me to take a moment in the middle of very important issues that we are still discussing today. Thank you for your courtesy and allowing me to take a moment of personal privilege to speak about someone who has been with me a long time, who is moving on to other opportunities, and appreciate family and friends in the gallery and want to have an opportunity to salute him. I have a phenomenal member of my staff who has been a critical part of my team for a long time, Matt Williams, and we are excited for his new opportunities, but we're still not sure we're going to let him go because he's been so incredibly important to my success over a lot of years. All the way back to 2006, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan joined my Senate campaign as a press assistant. Matt Williams did such a great job that I hired him as a staff assistant in my East Lansing office, and over the next 17 years, Matt has taken on so many different roles and done each one of them so successfully, from press assistant to press secretary to my regional manager in Detroit, to deputy communications director, to now my staff director of the Senate Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and the best communications director on Capitol Hill, for sure. He's been a part of my team for so long that the last time I think Matt quit a job was when he was in college at Joe's Crab Shop, yes. His time with me has taken him from Michigan to DC, back to Michigan, and now back to DC. Along the way, he married his wonderful wife, Amber, and they've since added 2 wonderful boys to their family, Max and Ben. I think Max is with us today. When Matt's not in the office, there's a pretty good chance he's at a school event or a Little League game. Over the years, he's spoken with a lot of reporters, planned a lot of press conferences, taken a lot of my calls, and never passed up the opportunity to remind me which Michigan university he thinks is better. He's wrong, of course. I think the chair actually would agree with Matt on this, but he's wrong. But he's been right on so many things over the years that I've been able to overlook his love for all things maize and blue. One of the first things you notice about Matt is his positivity, his good-natured smile, wonderful sense of humor. It's partly what makes him such a great leader. He's also a great team player who's unfailingly level-headed and reasonable. Takes a lot to get Matt Williams flustered. He's also incredibly knowledgeable about our state, the people who live here, our 10 media markets, and if we're going to be honest, the best places to golf. Matt has also done a wonderful job as staff director of the Senate Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. For our caucus, we are all of us, very, very grateful. Under his leadership, we've modernized the committee services, including launching the first ever DPCC Floor Watch app. And we've strengthened the C in DPCC by working with the caucus to amplify our accomplishments and highlight policy differences between the 2 parties. Matt is from Flint, so to him, I know the Flint water crisis was personal. He fought by my side to do everything we could to make things right for the people of Flint, the families and the community. Some of my fondest memories with Matt are from our bipartisan 2019 CODEL to South Korea and Vietnam, organized by Senator Leahy. I'll never forget standing at the DMC with Matt taking pictures of North Korean soldiers while they were taking pictures of us. Matt was a wonderful travel partner, and I was really honored to be with him as he experienced the country where he was born. Matt, thank you so much for your 17 years of hard work, your wonderful talent, and your dedication to Michigan and our country. We're all going to miss your optimism and your smiling face around the office, and I know that folks are going to miss your candy bowl. You'll always be a part of Team Stabenow and a part of my extended family for sure. I wish you and Amber and the boys every happiness and success always. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.